Hello, everyone, and welcome back. So today, we are going to be taking a little bit of a break from our past few episodes, which have done a lot to talk about cultural topics and cultural issues in the present day, which I do intend to continue talking about. But for today's episode, we're going to go back in time and talk about economic policies from the 1990s, specifically the Democratic Party's economic platform during Bill Clinton's administration. So my guest today is Lily Geismer, who is the author of two books, Left Behind and Don't Blame Us. Essentially, her thesis is that Democrats had forsaken the issues of the working class and instead focused too much on free market liberalism, or what we might call neoliberalism. And I think that it's a very fascinating thesis, and I really enjoyed getting a chance to talk to her about her thesis about why the Democratic coalition rejected the interests of the working class back in the 90s, and what it said about stuff like welfare policy back then. Yeah, so I thought it was a really interesting conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Ready when you are.
Okay, I'm all set.
Lily Geismer, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah. So I guess we're going to start off by just talking about stuff that's related to like Bill Clinton's administration from decades ago. So I guess to begin, could you give the audience a little bit of a primer as to like who the DLC were?
Sure. So the DLC are this group that their full name is the Democratic Leadership Council, and they're no longer in existence. And they're a kind of they seem sort of like an artifact, but of this sort of brief moment. But they were really, really important in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and they're central to the argument of my book Left Behind. So the DLC was started officially in 1985 by a group of largely white, moderate Southern Democratic politicians, and along with a congressional campaign staffer named Al Fromm, who became the executive director. And basically, they were Democrats, but they were committed to changing the direction of the Democratic Party. They felt that the Democratic Party was kind of in a period of decline. A lot of this came from the fact that the Democrats had lost the previous two presidential races against Ronald Reagan, first 1980, and this was right after 1984, where Mondale had been really had a really, really big defeat. And the idea was that Walter Mondale was like sort of this traditional Democrat. And that was not who the party should be running. So they really wanted to change the kind of direction of the party, both ideologically and then also kind of who its composition was. So they came together for that purpose. And I can keep going if you have more questions I can go on and on about the DLC, but that's kind of who they were. So they formed, and they were quite successful in their mission. I mean, one of the things that they were doing was both in terms of kind of they felt that the party had become too beholden by special interests. And that's an interesting term because like when we think about special interests now, we think of like big business, but actually that they didn't think that was the problem. They thought it was like when they talked about special interests, they meant kind of the kind of constituencies of color, women, and then especially labor, like that the labor movement held too much power within the Democratic Party. So they wanted to kind of shift that away and kind of get the party to regain its support, both somewhat amongst working class whites, but mostly amongst sort of moderate suburbanites who had been moving towards the Republican Party. And then they also believed in kind of a new, and this is really the subject of my book, which is this kind of that the Democrats had to change their kind of policy orientation, particularly their economic policies, and that also goes to kind of labor. That the party had been too focused on kind of shoring up the kind of like manufacturing industries, and that was kind of like that area of economic growth was done. They had to kind of focus on other things, particularly on kind of post-industrial growth of tech, finance, and trade. And then their other big thing was to kind of think about how to sort of reduce the size of government, but also to make government much more efficient by bringing in market-oriented techniques. And then they were really committed, and this is like a huge part of my research into thinking about how to use market techniques to address the problems of poverty and inequality. The next kind of key piece of the Democratic Party, he was not or the DLC, I'm sorry, he was not one of the founding members or leaders initially, but very early on, Bill Clinton joins the DLC. He at the time was governor of Arkansas, and he becomes their head in 1990, which also in 1991 he officially takes on that role, which helps to really change the direction of the organization. He becomes kind of this great leader and also really critical to his success in capturing the Democratic presidential nomination in 1992 and then eventually the presidency. So the kind of politics of Bill Clinton and the politics of the DLC become kind of intertwined, and that's really where they get a lot of power because because of their role in getting in Bill Clinton becoming president.
Yeah, so I do find it interesting, like the way that the DLC treated big business compared to the way that we might do so now. So I guess to ask a question that might be tangentially related. So you mentioned the whole thing about how the DLC tried to like steer the Democrats into like a bit of a different ideological direction than like maybe other coalitions might want them to be. So what would you say would be some of the main ideological differences between the DLC and say like the Democrats of like the New Deal era or even later on like the Great Society and such?
Yeah, so this is really important. They see themselves, and one of the things they're trying to do is to really differentiate themselves from the kind of traditional the kind of who the Democrats had long been, and especially going back to this idea of the New Deal and the Great Society, who traditionally are known for their kind of commitment to government, and the ideas of kind of government as solutions to problems, and producing kind of issues of inequality, of addressing issues of inequality, of helping people in need. Those should sort of come through government programs. Another kind of key and critical piece of those movements of both the New Deal and the Great Society is like their strong commitment to like Keynesian style economic growth. So those are kind of critical parts of what of the kind of New Deal, Great Society, and they see themselves as very much like differentiated from that. I mean, the other part of it is like is kind of particular kinds of coalitional politics that are very committed to things like labor and kind of types of jobs that would be helping the labor movement. I think some of the issues, and this is something I explore in the book, is that oftentimes the DLC and the kind of figures who are associated with it created a kind of almost strawman version of the New Deal and Great Society. So like what historians have found is like these are not necessarily they sort of presented the New Deal as far more redistributive than it actually was. The same thing at the Great Society was not a redistributive program. It was a program that was working on kind of giving the whole idea is like a hand up, or that's the war on poverty, like a hand up, not a handout. But it was very sort of supportive of those types of programs. But their idea was that like government should what the DLC was trying to move away from was this particular view of government. I will say too, I mean, this is honestly, I go into the book as well. They didn't it isn't that they were anti-government, so that they often get treated as and this, when they actually were founded, people called them like Republican light. And that it was just kind of like that they were like sort of Reaganites. That's not the case. Like they did believe in the idea of government. They just had a different kind of view of what government should be doing. And so oftentimes I use one of the words they use a lot in their literature is government as catalyst. So the idea of the government is to kind of bring together the public and private sectors. And so they believe that a lot of the things that were formerly done by the government could kind of be done by the private sector. We're very strongly committed to private sector growth. And so that was some of the kinds of key parts of what they were kind of trying to move against, if that makes sense. And then I think also this question of like sort of who should be the constituencies of the Democratic Party. The Democrats had long had this kind of strong support amongst working class voters and groups of color. the DLC was much more committed to a much more like sort of affluent voter base for a variety of different reasons, but that was part of what they were trying to pursue as well.
Yeah, so I guess one of the things that I find the most fascinating is the relationship between the DLC and like their perception that labor was getting too much of a focus in the Democratic Party. So would you consider it accurate to say that one of their attempts to differentiate themselves from labor would be to try to take the government and try to like support having the government outsource many of their responsibilities to the private sector?
That's part of their reason. I don't know if that's necessarily anti-labor. That was more that they want to make government kind of more efficient. And so this idea was that like if you had a smaller government, cost less money, therefore people are paying less in taxes. So that was some of the idea. I think the other thing that they really wanted to do is to kind of use what they thought they saw markets as quite like efficient delivery mechanisms, and so that you could actually use like market mechanisms to make government more efficient. So bringing in kind of market tools into government. I think with the labor, I mean, the bigger question was like where the sort of they thought the labor was like a drag on the Democratic Party, like the things that it was asking for, or the things the movement asked for. Were like hurting the Democrats and kind of trying to in their efforts to kind of transform for like the new set like the sort of end of the 20th, beginning of 21st century moment, and especially economically. And that has to do much more with like very labor oriented industries. So the people who become the DLC, and I should say like they're precursors of these groups that first are called the Watergate babies, and then all the great name of the Atari Democrats, and these are people I've looked at in actually both of my books. They believe that the sort of economic future of the United States lay in much more, as I said, like sort of tech oriented work, and so some of it was trying to kind of grow the tech industry, also things like financial services. Those areas, and less in kind of manufacturing, which is where a lot of unionized jobs are, but was much more, they saw kind of on the way out. And so they were in support of a kind of, a sort of version of like offshoring a lot of that work. And then kind of supporting these more kind of what they saw as like the future-oriented industries that would sort of help save the United States. I think different than the Republicans on these fronts of kind of a trade-oriented vision, they still believed in kind of doing something for workers. So a lot of it came to be with like worker retraining and other types of things that would kind of convert some of these former workers into having kind of a more sort of tech-oriented jobs of the future.
Yeah, so maybe it would be accurate to say that like a lot of the vision that the DLC had, like in the present day, we might think of them as like technocrats.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely they're heavily technocratic, and that's one thing that's a longstanding trend within liberals in the Democratic Party, is to have this kind of more technocratically oriented visions of kind of how you make change. I think they're also like tech. So, I mean, they're also pro tech, like tech lovers. And the other figure who's really crucial to in the DLC, but also to the Clinton administration, is Al Gore, who's like, famously said that he invented the internet, which is like he gets a lot of people made a lot of fun of him for. But he was someone who was very, very supportive of the tech industry, and that's in both the kind of and that is kind of an area. So they're very tech minded, and this is where you also see in the 90s this kind of new relationship between the Democratic Party and the tech industry. So, which had not been as tight before, and now we have to like associate them together. But that was something that was like emerged in this particular moment.
Yeah. So, what would you say to someone who might like listen to us and then say that like maybe the technocratic aspect of the DLC was like at least partially vindicated in later decades with the decline of things like manufacturing, or like the fact that it's being outsourced to like other countries? What would you say to that argument?
So just to clarify, technocratic often means like a particular style of governance that's much more kind of like focused on sort of small officials, like tech oriented, I think. Is that's sort of what you're talking about? Yeah, I mean, so like people that this vision was like borne out. And some of that had to do with like the policies in which that they like advocated for and produced, which sort of like shored up the tech industry in all kinds of ways and gave lots of credits, like tax credits, other kinds of things that was like very supportive of that industry. So I think it's like, it's not necessarily that it was like inevitable that happened. I think there's a lot of support that went into that process. And I think, that might be like someone saying like that was all this was they like knew what they were onto something. But the other side of that is that like this kind of their decisions in various different ways to pursue a particular kind of economic policy led to fundamentally like increased inequality across the American economy. So having business and industry skewed towards things like tech and like the finance industry and trade has had cascading effects in sort of producing inequality. And like the joke, like the kind of title of my book, The Left Behind, about failing to solve how the Democrats failed to solve inequality, is actually that like what they did in their efforts to solve it, it just enhanced it, and structurally in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, so I find that interesting, but like I guess let's zero in on this a little bit more. So you talked a little bit about the Clinton administration's attempts to address inequality. So did the Clinton administration have any kind of consensus about the relationship between trying to address inequality and trying to grow the economy?
Yeah, I mean, they thought those things should go together. So, and I would say oftentimes they didn't talk about inequality necessarily. It was like actually poverty, so that they wanted to like kind of see the problems of poverty. But what they believed, and this is like a huge part of what I argue in my book, is that they thought that the very same tools that they could use to grow the economy to address that problem could also solve the problems of poverty, and so that you could use the market to do both. That like these kinds of, so one of the big pieces of it that I look at in the book is like a promotion of entrepreneurship. So they were very committed to the idea like entrepreneurial growth was like growing at things at the top end of the economy. So this is like the moment in the 90s where you get like figures, like Bill Gates really like coming to the forefront, and that was like a really good thing to the American economy, despite like the monopolies and all the other stuff. But that was really good. And then also that you could use that same kind of entrepreneur, like sort of promote entrepreneurial oriented business amongst poor people. And so that the solution to the loss of manufacturing jobs, like I use the example in the book of Arkansas. So like Arkansas, the state that Bill Clinton is from, has like, it goes through tremendous amounts of industrial decline in the 70s and 80s, especially as a lot of its main industries move overseas. The idea was like the solution to losing the main factory in your town was like you didn't need those jobs, like you didn't need to have a factory job. Instead, you could like start your own business. And that would also be like a solution to welfare. Like you didn't have to get welfare payments. You could like start a business as a daycare, start your own daycare company, start your own catering company, something like that. And that could like sort of become self-sustaining. So they very much believe in those kinds of those kinds of solutions. And then the other thing, so that's really central. And so in the book, I look a lot at very early. Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton were big advocates of microfinance and microenterprise, which had been a tool used in parts of the global south, especially in Bangladesh. And they bring the kind of who's considered the founder of the kind of like inventor of microfinance, Muhammad Yunus, to Arkansas to start these kinds of programs there in the 80s. And then they start to like promote that when Bill Clinton is running for president and then as president too. So those are the kinds of ways that they're thinking about the two things going together. The other key piece that I look at in the book is this ideas of like kind of like what they call like win-wins or doing well by doing good, which is that you could take that it would be good for American businesses to kind of seek out like and do things to help address the issues of poverty. And so one of their big programs is this thing called like of new markets. And so to sort of say to American businesses, like treat areas of the United States that are going through that are experiencing extreme poverty, like you are to the like parts of the global south, like a new market that you can tap, because you have all these people who you could potentially hire, but also who are potential consumers. And so that's a big part of their efforts too, that like this would be good for, it's good for businesses' images to kind of invest in these particular areas, but it's also like good for their bottom lines.
So they're making like a pragmatic argument of like this thing that would be good for society would also be good for you. Is that the way?
Absolutely. So yeah, it's a thing that's a huge part of it, that you can do these like two things at once. So like, and that's like the idea of like a win-win. Like you can, this will help your company, but it'll also help your company's image, but you're also like doing something good for American society. And I see that as like the kind of core, like a core piece of the kind of larger philosophy of this kind of version of the Democrats, and like sort of where the Democratic Party comes to. In that process, what you end up seeing is a kind of larger, at the same time, is like a larger evisceration of the social welfare, like what is left of the social sort of what social welfare is, or social safety net. Because instead of saying like rely on first of all, like a union wage job, and like various different things like welfare, other kinds of social safety nets, like the market can solve those problems for you. So like now you'll have a business coming in who can like do those kinds of things, or you can do it for yourself. And that has like that is something that like sort of enhances inequality and like the sort of vulnerability of people in the lower end of the economic sectors in the 1990s.
What would you say to someone who might listen to this and might have their eye on history and think of it in terms of like, this was like necessary low-hanging fruit to move the needle forward to get to where we are now, so that we can be a little bit more explicit about some of the more some of the more tensiony aspects of free market liberalism as it relates to inequality?
So one thing I'm going to go back for 1 second that I wanted to say before to your question of like, and then I'll answer that question too. So one thing, just to go back to the question of like what was different about the New Deal to the kind of this version of liberalism, is like, and this is where I like use the idea of like doing well by doing good. So the New Deal and Great Society believed in like they also believed in economic growth. It was really central to both of those systems and sort of visions. But like throughout much of the 20th century, or from like what Democrats believed in or liberals believed in, Democratic liberals, was like the idea of like doing well and doing good. So that you like one part was like was like the economic growth, that was the doing well, and then you're doing good, which is like a compensatory welfare state. So what ends up happening is this effort to fuse those two things so that you could like do them together, so that like the doing well could then help the doing good. The question of like, if this like, and this is like very much kind of, I mean, in some ways, like, becomes, and this is where it's not like a decline of the Democratic Party, but like a transformation of its values and ideals, that you begin to see, and a kind of, I guess, a commitment to a much more like market oriented and like a promotion of the free market by the 21st century. I don't know if I necessarily like, I'm curious, like when the question of like, is this a necessary evil? Like who are the free market liberals you're talking about that this helped get to?
I think what I meant more is that like, this is like specific low-hanging fruit where like, if there are specific tensions between trying to increase inequality and trying to like be willing to like give up on some of like the capitalist dream, like that is something that is like a worthwhile tension that is worth reckoning, but that would come later. And right now, like there are still low-hanging fruit in terms of like positive sum developments for everyone that can already be exploited, and like some of the like the necessary stuff to talk about in terms of the ways in which they are in tension with each other, that's still worth talking about. But we could at least like reap the rewards of stuff that like we can deal with in a positive some way and haven't before. What would you say to that?
I don't know if the thinking was that strategic or that like pragmatic. I think that I think there's a way that like people often look to the Clinton era or the Clinton administration and say like everything they did was just to like get, it was all about just like, sort of getting reelected. That's like the sort of idea of triangulation, or that they like, and that like it was all basically like they were just like stealing ideas from the Reagan administration. Like I think one thing I really tried to show in the book is like they actually really believed in this. Like they really believed in this vision. They really thought that in this like capacity of the market to do good. And so one thing I like say is that like I actually think they were more influential in promoting that idea of like the positive powers of the market than someone like Milton Friedman. I think that the issue, I mean, and it's an interesting one of like, did this win out? In some ways, like one thing we've seen in the last, I would say like the last decade plus, probably since like 2008 or so, has been, first of all, the results of like this like produced sort of forms of just increased inequality. And I think that like the 2008 recession and its aftermath is like a very, very stark pronouncement of that. But I also think you've seen like profound alienation and frustration with it coming from both the left and the right. And so people who just don't feel that this is the solution to the vast problems of kind of structural inequality.
Yeah. Would you mind if I push back on that a little bit more?
Sure.
Yeah. So what would you say to someone who might respond to that by saying that like addressing inequality is not as big of a problem as like addressing poverty? And it's like, the whole concept of like, this is like the whole classic neoliberal argument about how a rising tide raises all ships, where if inequality increases, but like it increases in a way such that everyone's standard of living increases and like poverty still decreases, maybe that's still a net positive and that's still something that like we should celebrate. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the argument. Like, that's what many people sort of feel about the Clinton era. Like, there's this argument, about it that like, well, it was all the economy grew exponentially. And like, that's, and so that was a good, that's overall a good thing that like overall, like, and even, and there's often arguments too that like, it's better to be a poor person in the United States or something like that because you, it's still a higher standard of living. That's not, the vision that I believe in. I think that like, and I think one of the things that happens is that what this did in particular is that like probably, that there's a longstanding expectation built into the social contract that government has a particular role to help people in need. So I think the question of like, even in its ability to address the questions of poverty, so like irrespective of inequality, like if we separate what it's inequality and what's poverty, those are two different questions. There's lots of issues about like, I can bracket like, I can go on about the questions of like the problems of inequality and like in like sort of producing a democracy. But is it okay?
No, so I just wanted to preemptively apologize. I'm just letting you know I'm going to keep pushing back against you.
Sure, that's fine. Yeah. That's totally fine.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, keep going.
So there's like sort of fundamental problems in a democracy with those, with inequality. I think the other question about the issue of poverty is the fact that like there has long been an expectation that government has a responsibility to address the issues of poverty. And I think one of the things that happened over the Clinton years was an effort to eliminate the kinds of programs and what was kind of available to address those problems. So you have reduced capacity to do that by this kind of reliance on the market. And I think that has been what we've seen happen in the subsequent 20 years. And I would say actually, like particularly the last like 6 to 8 years, is in like moments of crisis, there's not the ability of government programs to step in the way that they could because the capacity just isn't there.
Yeah. So I am curious though, like, do you think, so I guess let's start by focusing on a lot of Bill Clinton's anti-poverty policies. So you spend a lot of the time in your book talking about microfinance, but I think like if we were to like zoom out a little bit and look at like broader like welfare measures in general, like would you say something along the lines of like the work requirements in a lot of the like in say for example the PRWORA Like, do you think that that's a good example of like free market liberalism in a negative way in their welfare policies, in a way that prevented them from reducing poverty?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the issue is like there's a number of sort of the problem. I mean, so this idea of like shifting to welfare to work, which is another of these like kind of doing well by doing good, or win-win ideas. So one of the ideas was like you take people off welfare, you now have a new capacity for workers there. They're self-reliant. The other side of it is that you now have like new workers. So one of the things is like, first of all, that program was produced in a moment of economic like sort of prosperity, when there was a very sort of ample labor market. So it only works when there's jobs available because you're not actually creating new jobs. Like, it's not saying there's not a job creation aspect to it. The other thing is that the jobs that were available, because there wasn't sort of substantial like education involved, or other kinds of things involved in it, it was a lot of jobs that were not didn't have a lot of capacity for upward mobility. So primarily jobs in the service sector, which are very, very low paying, and often in like things like fast food, and daycare. So the questions of like that actually working, like I think that for many people actually were ended up being in a worse off place financially than they were when they were on welfare. And I should say like that, the welfare system of the in the United States of the 80s and 90s was by no means like a kind of utopian vision. Like, it was not Sweden. And I mean, it was like people were in a very precarious position. But what things like welfare to work did was to make that much worse. I think the other piece of it that didn't come up, but not just the work requirements, but was also the mandatory cutoff, so that you could only get it for a certain amount of time. So that also puts people in a much, much more vulnerable position.
Yeah, so one thing you said that I thought was really interesting would be that like a lot of these recipients would end up being in a worse position than they would have been without welfare. So then I guess my next question would be like, do you think that Bill Clinton's welfare policies were a net negative towards society as a whole?
You mean welfare reform?
Yeah, like, do you think that like it would have been better for him to not pass anything than pass what he did?
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because like historians we don't do counterfactual. So I don't like it's not, or like sort of hypothetical questions like that. I think it goes a couple of ways. Like, I think the program as it existed had a lot of problems with it. I think what ends up happening when you pass things like welfare reform is it became very, very difficult to then to subsequently to come up with other kinds of reforms. So I think people across the board, like, there was no one in the early 1990s saying like the welfare system is like AFDC is a great program and like it should just be like continued. I think a lot of people are saying it needs to be funded a lot more and it needs to have a lot more support. So that would be the question too, but it foreclosed the possibility for subsequent welfare reform. Like, we have not had a kind of efforts to kind of change that once it's been passed, and it's almost 30 years old. So I think that is a fundamental problem. I think the other thing with a lot of these programs is like, and I say this about like, micro enterprise or microfinance, so a small piece of it. To me, it's symbolic of the kind of vision of of Clinton and the Democratic Party. But like, I don't think it's a bad idea. Like, I think if people want to start their own business, that's great. If that, like, you should be able to do that. But I think the question is like, if you have that without other kinds of supports, like without a nationalized healthcare system, like that was often what a lot of people actually suffer severe amounts of medical debt, who are part of these kinds of programs. So if you don't have those kinds of things in place, if you don't have a kind of a system of education, other kinds of basic needs being met, then it's very difficult to address to have these kinds of work-based reforms that the Clinton administration was advocating for.
Yeah. So what would you say would have been like some movements within the Democratic Party that may have like disagreed with the DLC at the time, whereas if they had their way, it would have led to a much better outcome than the welfare policies that Bill Clinton passed instead?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I'll say two things to that. One is like, and then the question for like alternatives. So, I mean, like who becomes, and I played up in my book a lot, but like who was a big adversary at the DLC was the kind of, I mean, there are some like still left of center Democrats who, are in Congress or other places at that moment. But I think the big figure, who becomes their kind of adversary is like Jesse Jackson and the kind of Rainbow Coalition model. And that was a much more the platforms that Jesse Jackson ran on in the 1980s when he ran for president both times was a much more sort of socially social democratic vision. I think it's something that like you can see, maybe you'll see sort of like nascent versions of that in what like Bernie Sanders ran on in 2016 and 2020. So those as kind of alternative models for what could have been possible, which have been a lot more state support. I mean, they were like basically Jesse Jackson's calling for like a Marshall Plan for urban America. A lot more supports for farmers, for housers, less kind of the kind of heavy trade oriented policies that come into being. So those are alternatives. I mean, I think one thing that I found really interesting looking at the book was actually like an absence, though, once Bill Clinton is president, of like a lot of meaningful pushback from the left. And so, we see this today in the United States. Like it's a very different, this is one way that the 90s are a different moment than the like 2016 to 2024. Like you have a left in the United States is pushing against the sort of center of the Democratic Party in various different ways. And I think that affected Joe Biden's policies for sure, particularly on economic issues and on some of these kinds of social welfare issues as well. That did not exist in the same way in the 1990s, that many people were afraid, like many people on the left had just endured 12 years of Republican presidents, and felt like Democrats were better than nothing. So that they kind of went along, they protested particular things, a lot of these kinds of policies. And so I think that actually, to me, was like actually fundamental in allowing for some of it to get passed. You didn't have a lot of pushback against it.
So do you think so you mentioned that like Jesse Jackson and co, they might have like advocated for like a full-on Marshall Plan when it comes to addressing problems like poverty. Do you think the problem was that like those policies were politically feasible and could have been passed? Or do you think it's just that like there should have been more pushback from that direction, regardless of whether the exact granular details of their policies were politically feasible in that moment?
Yeah, I think it's hard. I mean, so that this is something that a lot of people like debate about the Clinton era. And I would say there also were like progressive people within the Clinton administration who are advocating for certain kinds of things. So I think that, I think it's a hard question if it would have been, just Clinton, he just felt like it was political, like what was politically possible, or actually like went for certain kinds of didn't go after certain kinds of things that he could have. Like another one is like, so Robert Reich was really advocating for a lot of spending on infrastructure. And that would have led to number one, like the United States had like a massive infrastructure problem, as it still does. But number two, like it would have addressed the like a lot of the questions of jobs that were needed. And the Clinton administration decided not to pursue that path. And so that there's a question of like that might have actually been politically possible, but they made a calculation not to do it. And instead, like the other kind of, they went for a much more pro-finance orientation of their initial economic policy, which had like, sort of, and especially instead of doing infrastructure spending, decided to work on deficit reduction in an effort to kind of regain the confidence of Wall Street. And that has had longstanding impact in a number of different ways.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding you correctly, is your argument that like there are potential paths where like the Bill Clinton administration could have gone much further and farther with regards to trying to reduce poverty, and part of the reason that they didn't is not just because of political constraints, but because of ideological ones as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's like, I definitely think that that's some of it. I think that there's this idea that often like, and this happens both with Clinton, it also happens sometimes with Obama, as well with Obama too, that it was just the kind of the constraints of the right that led to the kind of production of particular kinds of policies. And I do think like, I mean, Clinton vetoed welfare reform twice. Like, I don't think the things like the marriage requirements and stuff like were things that he like necessarily advocated for. I mean, if you actually read through what welfare
also, could you explain the marriage requirements?
I mean, they had certain kinds of things like you had to like be in like marriage training classes. Another one was like it was profoundly and like there was like abstinence training, and there was very, very like I would say punitive policies embedded. Another one that was I think doesn't get enough attention was like it didn't allow welfare benefits to even authorized immigrants. So it wasn't just like undocumented, but actually like unauthorized. A lot of authorized immigrants could not have access to it. So I don't think those are things that Bill Clinton like necessarily supported. But like he wanted to get welfare reform passed. So there are certain things that like he went beyond, but he was someone who believed in work requirements, like dating back to the mid 1980s in Arkansas. I'd advocated for kind of work-based programs. So I do think it's ideological. I don't think it's necessarily just that it was like the Republicans doing it. I think it's important to point out though that like Clinton was not operating in like a frictionless world. Like it wasn't like there was like an increasingly strong opposition from conservatives and in Congress. And then during the late part of his administration, he also was dealing with the impeachment inquiry. So those affected some of the possibilities of what he could do. But I think most of what happens on issues like poverty and on the ways the policies that produce a lot of inequality have to do more with ideology.
Yeah, but would you say that like his ideology still like, do you think that it at least staved off some of the worst impulses when it comes to Republican like ideas about anti-poverty like during his administration?
It depends on which aspects of poverty poverty policy you're looking at. So, would it have been, is a Clinton administration better than, a Republican administration? Is that what you're trying to ask? Like would it have been
Yeah,
better?
do you think, would you consider it to be better than like some counterfactual about a Republican administration?
I don't know, actually, on some of those questions. I think it would have been different. But I think that, like, as I said, I think what it did is to kind of blunt alternative possibilities from coming to the forefront. And so that to me, in some ways, has, certain, I would say, I don't know if it's worse or better, or those are the kinds of terms. I mean, in some ways, like a lot of these policies become continuations, like Clinton's bracketed by two Republican administrations who take on a lot of the same ideas. So on those things, I mean, I think it's hard to say if it's like would have been better or worse. What do you think?
I think that it's infinitely better than like. Can I push back even more? Was that okay?
Sure.
Yeah. So there's one negative review of your book that I read in the Washington Post by David Greenberg.
Mm-hmm.
He's kind of like scathing towards you. And I'm kind of interested in your opinion.
I also got a lot of positive reviews for the book too.
Yeah. Well, I think that the reception was largely positive, and I think but would you mind if I quoted his review?
Sure.
Yeah. You wouldn't know from Left Behind that one of Clinton's greatest triumphs came in the 1995 to 96 budget battle when he defended Medicare and Medicaid and staved off tax cuts favoring the wealthy from Republican House Speaker Newt Gingrich, who shut down the federal government twice trying to coerce the president. So I'm not a historian, but like, would you accept his premise that like Bill Clinton, regardless of his flaws, was still able to like stave off some of the worst potential excesses of like Republican ideas for what laws should pass?
Yeah, I think that's true. I don't think it was just Clinton. I think he also was dealing. I mean, they also had Democrats in Congress who did those kinds of things. So I think that's like an overly singular view of Bill Clinton and his capacity. I think the things like the negotiations with Gingrich was able to do certain kinds of things. So I think on some grounds, like yes, it was better to have a Democrat, having a Democratic administration was positive. I mean, I think that like if you look through, if you've ever read like Contract with America or some of the things that Republicans were trying to advocate for in the 1990s, like a lot of those things were would have, could have been profoundly negative for the United States. You had I don't think and we've seen some of those things like then pan out. I think like on certain kind of cultural issues, the Clinton administration was able to do certain kinds of things. I think it's just too easy to be like, it was a net positive for the country. And I think that's a very like, I think the Greenberg Review and the and his other writings is a very selective vision of the Clinton administration, coming from someone who like has a very highly favorable view of them, in a way. And like, I don't hate Bill Clinton. Like, I actually always say, like, I think one thing I came away from working on the book for is like, I think that he's a profoundly gifted politician. I think in some way, like a once in a generation politician. I was actually also really, I spent years reading through the administration's documents. And I think one of the things I came away from is like how involved he was, he's a complete policy, Bill Clinton was a complete policy wonk. And so he was like very, very invested in the kinds of decision making. And I think that's been the one thing, like we've seen in subsequent presidents, has not necessarily been the case. So I like had a profound respect on both of those fronts, for the capacity to like, I think one thing that Bill Clinton did really effectively as a politician is to translate material, so translate like sort of policy into like accessible terms that sort of galvanize a lot of people. I think that's an important skill of a politician, especially a president. So I have like a lot of respect for that. But I do think a lot of the kinds of administration's policies led to a kind of particular ways of making the structure of the American economy and the structure of the American welfare state a lot more precarious than it had been, than it might have been, I guess, if it had been another Democrat in office.
Could you walk me through some of the examples of like the way that a potential like working class person might be harmed by Bill Clinton's welfare policy even more than if there was no welfare?
Sure. So I think on one ground, I think first of all, would be welfare reform, that you would have received a particular amounts of payment. A lot of those things are the question of like how you were harmed, is also state based. So it depends on like where in the country you are, because a lot of the programs went to the state level. But if you're a working class white person in North Carolina, you had a stable unionized job. And at a factory, at a like textile factory or something. I'm just making it up. And that job closed over the course of the 1990s. So that's not, you're in a much more vulnerable position. You don't have a chance to get another job. In the same time, other kinds of services in your community collapsed. So those are the kinds of things where you were in a less positive place. And the solutions that were coming in were the idea that this would sort of help people in need.
Yeah. So what would you say would be like, what would you consider to be like an ideal welfare policy for that type of person? And what would differentiate that from like the types of welfare policy that we might have right now in the 21st century in the U.S.?
I think if you think writ large, you would have that person would be living in parts of North Carolina. They'd have a stable job. I don't know if necessarily it should be in like textiles, but they would have a stable unionized job where they were making above a living wage. I think going back to like the moments of like the kind of like great compression of the 1950s, where like you could have where like a working class job was actually like you could live a middle class life. You didn't even have just like a pension. You had you had a strong pension, so that gave you sort of security. You had nationalized healthcare to help with your various different healthcare needs. You knew that your school, you knew that your family wasn't in a nursing home that was like 100 miles from where you lived, so you could actually go visit them. You had access to, a stable system of education that wasn't necessarily like heavily standards based, which is another thing that Bill Clinton brought in. So I think all of those things like potentially, would be an alternative vision. And I don't think with a lot of those things, I think they've actually like contracted since the 1990s in, many of the different categories I've said, especially on healthcare.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you think that a lot of those have contracted since the 1990s. Do you think that a lot of the anti-poverty bills that we've put in place have like gotten worse over time?
I don't know if I would say it's necessarily linear. I think that for a long time it wasn't necessarily like poverty was not or like the plight of like the working class was not necessarily like the dominant concern of many politicians, especially not many Democratic politicians. I mean, another huge issue that we didn't talk about, I would say, that happened under Bill Clinton that is a large part of my book and my larger research is about housing. So Bill Clinton also, like, there's a lot of attention to ending public to welfare, but that huge other part of Bill Clinton's programs are ending public housing as we know it, and converting public housing to market oriented to like mixed income market rate housing. And that had a huge impact on people like not having access to adequate housing. And I think also in the other piece of it is like the deregulation of the housing the housing industry and housing markets, which is like was an effort to like get more access, led to like a huge amount of foreclosures. So I think people are in a much more vulnerable position in terms of their housing. So I think a lot of those policies have not gotten better. I think that and I think on certain grounds, another one is like we did not have had particularly like union friendly policies in the United States for into the 21st century. Some of those things have changed. I think you've seen some of the efforts to address poverty actually came through during the pandemic, that there is like the capacity. So things like the child tax credit, other kinds of things like that show certain kinds of positive poverty programs, but most of them have been quite temporary.
Yeah, it's like if they were unfortunately just temporary stimulus during the pandemic, and I wish they went on for much longer.
Yeah, so those kinds of show. I mean, I think many people have looked at this, that like a lot of the programs that you say like what's gotten worse or better, like those showed possibilities of what some poverty programs could look like, and I think that that's been the issue, that like, but most of them were not permanent.
Yeah. Wait. So going back to housing, would you say that like Bill Clinton's solution to housing would be to essentially make it like a demand side approach?
Yeah, I mean, that was a huge part of it, was that like that's where it that like a large part of it was to put it on onto demand. And I think that there's like that there's many things that have kind of contributed to the housing crisis, but one of them has been this like actually was like was the reduction in actual public housing, turning to much more like and this is like the clearest way of taking something that was formerly government run and making it a like basically like a market solution, was also the use of housing vouchers. So you start to see those, but very limited in sort of the capacity. So there's a lot of those kinds of things that had a major impact on kind of our larger sort of housing landscape.
So would you say that like Bill Clinton's deregulation of the housing market was causally linked to many of the disasters surrounding housing later on, like the 2008 foreclosure crisis?
I don't think. I mean, I don't think there are causal connections. I don't think he's alone in doing it. So I wouldn't say like Bill Clinton caused the 2008 recession. I think that like a lot of there's a set of policies, and especially in terms of both deregulation of the housing markets and then also deregulation of financial services, that sort of come together to create the circumstances for the 2008 recession. At the same time, I think a lot of the policies of the Bush administration intensified those, which led to further deregulation of both of those sectors, and that had a major impact as well.
Yeah. So I guess what would you say would be like the main like ideological, I guess what you could say, call them obstacles, that you feel like if they were able to overcome those specific ideological underpinnings, then they could have been far more cognizant about how to truly address the interests of the working class?
You mean the Democratic Party under Clinton?
Yeah.
I don't think that they particularly wanted to address the interests of the working class. I mean, first would be like see working class people, like as the major priority and as their like major base. I mean, I think that's part of it too. Like we didn't talk about a large part of my research has been this effort, like this like sort of demographic tilt of the party much more towards like upper middle class people, but that was like kind of a major priority. So I think some of that was like, and so that would be one like the key ideological blinder was like to make sort of think about who your constituencies are in different kinds of ways. That would have a major impact. I mean, I think that some of it is like the and like is something I talk about in my book, but I think it's also this like belief in the capacity of the market to do good. And like that's like that, like so this idea of like believing in win-wins, like markets are systems that are like inherently, capitalism is an inherently unequal system. So I think understanding and recognizing that. I think also another was this idea of like fusing the public and private sectors. And so like bringing them together. And I think that one of them is like they each serve particular kinds of functions. So it's actually important to like sort of keep them separate. All of those would be things that I think would lead to like more, could have potentially, I guess, created a more sort of working class oriented set of policies from the Clinton administration.
All right. Final question. I guess like moving towards like the 21st century, who would you say have been some like major Democratic leaders where their vision for like anti-poverty or for like reaching out to the working class would be something that you would be far more supportive of than like other coalitions within the Democratic Party?
You mean like particular politicians? I mean, I think I don't know if I'm necessarily going to answer that, but I think that one thing that I've been really heartened by is like the labor movement itself, and sort of giving efforts to give the labor movement more power and more of a say, and like that's a way of kind of helping the collective interests of working class people. So I think that like one of the things that I think that like as we began the conversation about is like this effort of the Democratic Party to really to kind of in many ways sideline the labor movement and like its kind of influence on policy and various other matters. I think one of the things that's happened is like an effort to kind of bring efforts to kind of bring the labor movement in. So I would say like actually like a leader I see is like Sean Fain, the head of the UAW, who's I think had really far-reaching ideas about like how to address the longstanding interests of the labor of working class people. So and that's actually just labor, but I think like broader efforts to kind of address the needs of people in and out of the labor movement are really important.
All right. Lily Geismer, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.